Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to take a look at the common grasses in Kentucky, some characteristics about them, and how to identify them. When we think of grasses in Kentucky, we think mainly of our cool season perennials, and those are listed here. Tall fescue, orchard grass, Kentucky bluegrass would be the most common. Timothy and perennial ryegrass are also present. When you think of the annuals, you may be thinking of annual ryegrass, you may be thinking of crabgrass, or then again, you may not think of crabgrass because a lot of times you think of it as a weed, but it can be, and we have some improved varieties of crabgrass that are very high in quality, very high yielding, very useful to us in a pasture setting. Then you can have foxtail millets, the sorghums, and pearl millet. Let's start right off with the major grass, tall fescue. Most prevalent grass in Kentucky, present, has to be in every county. It's the most widely grown grass in the southeastern United States, for that matter. I included the scientific names here, not because that's terribly important, but that there are at least two or three that you may run into with tall fescue, but at any rate, they all relate to this grass that's common in Kentucky. And of course, the most common cultivar variety of tall fescue is Kentucky 31, which originated in Menifee County. It is a perennial, strong perennial. It's erect, tall growing. It is a bunch grass in that it never really spreads like white clover spreads or like bluegrass spreads, although it does have very short rhizomes. You can grow it for hay or for pasture, and again, it's adapted to most of the eastern United States. Tall fescue, I think, has a very characteristic leaf appearance, although tall fescue as a species can be quite diverse. But this is typically what you will see. You will see a shiny leaf. It's usually very broad, usually very coarse, with very prominent veins. When we think of the identifiable features, we talk about the bud orientation. In other words, how does the leaf come out of the stem? And with the case of tall fescue, it comes out rolled. The ligule is small and membranous, and I'll show you a picture of that, and also the claw-type auricles. The other characteristics that we sometimes key in on: prominent veins, edges of the leaves have fine serrations that can be rough if you run your fingers from the tip to the back towards the plant. The midvein is not prominent. The leaf is flat and does tend to be shiny. The leaves can be coarse or they can and broad, or it can be fine-leaved and lax, or another word for that is floppy. Here's a photograph of three photographs actually of tall fescue showing in the lower right where it's rolled in the bud, the very prominent auricles in the upper right, that's those clasping structures around the stem, and also the prominent veins and the coarseness of the leaf. It has a small membranous ligule, and I'll point to that with my pointer here, but that is very difficult to see unless you are like me, very nearsighted. So it does have a ligule that is very small. It has serrations along the edge of the leaf, so this is a very close-up picture of the leaf, and it has very prominent veins. I call it, it has a corduroy appearance. We talk about the management of tall fescue for grazing and hay. Tall fescue is very tolerant of close, frequent grazing. Most of the tall fescue in Kentucky is infected with a toxic endophyte that does cause us difficulty with both conception and intake and growth on young animals. We do have endophyte-free and novel or friendly endophyte tall fescue that do not have these toxic effects. And grazing tolerance and animal behavior is greatly influenced by the endophyte type and presence. It is the best grass for fall stockpiled tall fescue. In other words, that's grass that we save and fertilize in August for grazing later in December and January. For hay, it does produce a high yielding and pretty high quality hay when we harvest it in the late bloom to early head stage. And as I said before, it's a bunch grass. And the bunchiness of it tends to be very prominent in hay systems. Moving on to orchard grass, it is also a perennial bunch grass. Now, Perennial we will use loosely here with orchard grass because typically in a pure stand it will stay thick and for about 4 years, maybe a little more. It does not like, as the last bullet says, close grazing or close clipping. If we're making it as hay, one of the common mistakes, especially with our disc mowers, is cutting it too low. We need to raise up the shoes cutting height to about 4 inches for orchard grass to persist. As I said, I may have said it's erect and tall growing, high yielding, excellent for hay or for pasture. Use it alone or as a great companion grass for legumes. It is prone to summer leaf diseases as well, or the rusts. If we're going to identify it, if we've got the seed head like you see here, it's fairly easy because it has we call it an open panicle seed head, but you've got these clumps of seeds at the ends of stalks that are very characteristic of orchard grass. If we're looking at the vegetative features, then the stem bases give us some clue. In fact, it's one of the few cool season grasses that has a very flat stem. And when we talk about the bud orientation, or how does the leaf come out of the stem, it comes out folded, absolutely flat. So that is very characteristic of orchard grass. It has a very prominent ligule, that's this structure here. And it does not have auricles. In other words, it doesn't have the structures that reach around the stem. There's a close-up of that leaf collar region showing a much better view of the auricle, which is very large, the flat stem, and the lack of auricles. Another way, if you're looking just at the field level of the pasture grasses to identify it, is orchard grass, in my view, has a light green or a gray-green color. It has soft and floppy leaves, and the stem bases tend to be fairly tall. It is in high demand as hay, whether in pure stand or mixed with a legume. It is shade tolerant, but intolerant of close grazing or clipping, and it does require pretty good soil fertility in order to grow well. Moving on to Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is a very high quality grass. It is a sod former from rhizomes. It is lower yielding than tall fescue or orchard grass, and it tolerates close grazing. It is dormant in hot summers and heads out very early in the spring. In fact, it's one of the earliest grasses to send up a seed head, doing so in mid to late April. One characteristic of bluegrass is it's very fine-leaved. In fact, the leaves are almost the same width at the tip as they are at the base. Here is one of the characteristic features of bluegrass, and that is the seed head. We call it an open pyramid-shaped panicle, but in fact, the seed heads, when the flowers are beginning to come out, it has a bluish or purple color. And in my mind, that's why it is called bluegrass, and Kentucky's called the bluegrass state. When bluegrass is in the seed head stage, it will definitely have a blue cast to the field. And I think the grass itself is dark green or bluish green sometimes of the year, depending on many things. Another really identifiable characteristic of bluegrass is the keel-shaped leaf tip. And if you think of a boat's keel having a point and also being tilted upward, then if you take a look at the Kentucky bluegrass leaf tip, you can see it is also has a keel-shaped tip. Looking at it from the side, gives you a pretty good view. This is a drawing. And if you were to match that flat, those two, it would split and it would make 2 points. A lot of times you'll see bluegrass growing with tall fescue. And this is what happens when animals are given their preference about what they graze. Most of the time they prefer bluegrass over tall fescue, so the tall fescue winds up being coarser and taller, and the bluegrass grazed much closer to the ground. This happens to be a horse pasture, but the same would be true in many of your small ruminant pastures, although, as you know, grazing this close as the bluegrass is on the left is very tough in terms of parasite loading on your small ruminants. If you take the leaves and compare bluegrass on the left with fescue in the middle and orchard grass on the right, they do appear different. One thing you can see different is the width, but they have some other characteristics that are different. Kentucky bluegrass is a narrow leaf plant, what appears to be a double midvein. And let's take a look. You see this midvein area in the middle of the leaf, and in what looks like two dark lines. Actually, those are two grooves on the left and the right of the midvein, but it gives the appearance of a double midvein. Tall fescue, on the other hand, broader leaves, coarse appearance, prominent veins, and actually doesn't have much of a midvein, at least showing on the top at all. Orchard grass most often is broader yet, with a very soft feel. It does have a very prominent midvein. Moving on to Timothy, which is not very common in our pastures, but you'll find it sometimes because it is included in many pasture mixes. It is a perennial bunch grass. It's tall and erect growing, primarily grown for hay, usually in a monoculture, sometimes mixed with legumes, not used a lot for pasture. And Kentucky is really on the southern edge of its area of adaptation, which means it's going to suffer in the summertime and not be very long-lived. So when we say perennial for Timothy, 2 years, 3 years is what you would expect from a field of Timothy. When you identify Timothy, we're going to look primarily at two things. The seed head, which is cylinder shaped, and I'll show you a picture in just a moment, and the corms, which are structures at the base of the plant. It has a softer leaf appearance than tall fescue. And if you were looking at the tillers are rolled in the bud. They do have a prominent ligule, and they don't have auricles. But here is the structure that really gives Timothy away. This is the seed head, and we really have no other forage grass in Kentucky that has a seed head that looks quite like this. We talked about the corm or the haplocorm. That's this structure at the very base of the plant. This is the base of the stems, and this is right at the ground. That's a kind of a swelling or a swollen area. It winds up being an area where, or a structure that does store carbohydrates for Timothy. So if you suspect that a plant is Timothy, and you can pull up the plant so you can look at this area, you're going to be able to feel this thickening down here at the lower part of the stem base. If you talk about hay and grazing management, you're mainly talking about hay management. It produces a high-quality hay if it's harvested in the late boot to early reproductive stage. 70 to 80% of the seasonal yield comes in the first cutting, and has very little regrowth. You can pasture that regrowth, but most do not. Frequent defoliation is going to weaken the stand because it has a shallow root system and does not store very much in the way of carbohydrates. Let's talk about the annual and perennial ryegrasses, which are very useful grasses to us here in Kentucky, and we'll take a look at why that is. So you can see here the leaf collar region on the left resembles in a lot of ways tall fescue. Then the seed heads on the right, which are very characteristic and very different than most all the others we've looked at, Timothy, orchard grass, tall fescue, or bluegrass. The annual and perennial ryegrasses can have quite a different look. This is a true annual ryegrass on the left and towards the end of the spring or early summer, and it's at the stage where it's going to send up seed heads and basically die. This is a ryegrass, also an annual, that has to be vernalized in order for it to send up a seed head. So when we have a mild summer, it can actually, if we spring plant, it can last through the summer, and then next spring it will send up a seed head, and then it will die. Perennial ryegrasses and annual ryegrasses can, in this case, this is probably a perennial, can be very broad-leaved. It can be very vigorous and fairly tall growing. This is a bit deceptive because it's in the stem elongation stage, but it will have very shiny leaves. The ryegrasses have exceptional seedling vigor, exceptional. They're the most vigorous grass that we might raise in Kentucky of all of our cool seasons. They are without a doubt the highest quality cool season grass, and they are very palatable. In the annuals, we typically fall seed those mostly for early spring grazing. Perennials are similar to annuals, and we typically seed those in the fall, except they will last 2 to 3 years depending on how hot the summers are. And they are sometimes and even quite often used to repair damaged areas in pasture because of their quickness and ease of establishment. Let's talk a little bit about crabgrass. And crabgrass, of course, we think of as a weed, but in recent years, I'd say in the last 20 years or 30, the Noble Foundation, particularly R.L. Dalrymple in Oklahoma, has selected improved varieties of crabgrass that are more erect than the crabgrass we think of as one of our lawn and turf weeds. Let's talk about some of the characteristics. Of course, it is a summer annual. It is very high in quality and very palatable. The varieties like Red River, Mojo, and Quick and Big are very tall growing, but they are also very small seeded. I'll just mention briefly some of the other summer annual grasses. I will not go into these in detail, but you can certainly Google and find out plenty of information about these grasses by just simply searching for the name, followed by UKY, and you will find in the top of your search list our UK resources for those. Foxtail millet is grown a lot of times for wildlife, sometimes as a hay crop. The sorghum family, whether you're talking about Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, are quite commonly grown in midsummer to supplement our cool season pasture base, as is pearl millet, and pearl millet is shown there in the picture. So that brings us to the end of our quick discussion on common grasses in Kentucky and how to identify them. Next up, when we come back, the common legumes in Kentucky.